She sat quietly in seat 14A, hoodie pulled low so the cabin lights skimmed past her face without ever quite touching it, headphones resting over her ears not because music played but because silence helped her think, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the aircraft hummed with the ordinary, forgettable rhythm of a routine commercial flight, the kind people boarded half asleep and left barely remembering, and no one noticed her at all. Not the businessman scrolling through emails beside her, not the family arguing softly over armrests a few rows back, not even the flight crew gliding up and down the aisle with trained smiles, because there was nothing about her that demanded attention, nothing loud or restless or important, just another passenger among dozens suspended between destinations under a blue, forgiving sky. And outside the windows the clouds stretched endlessly, calm and harmless, promising an uneventful journey, until without warning the promise shattered and the cockpit alarm screamed with a sharp, metallic urgency that cut through the cabin like a blade, a sound that didn't belong in peaceful air, a sound designed to wake instinct and fear, and in the cockpit the captain's hands tightened on the controls as warning lights bloomed red and amber across the panel, each one shouting a different version of the same truth, that something fundamental was wrong. His voice, when it finally reached the cabin over the intercom, carried an edge he couldn't hide despite years of training. Autopilot fail. Your flight controls not responding. Words that landed heavy and unfinished, hanging in the air like smoke as passengers exchanged confused glances that turned to dread when the aircraft lurched just slightly, enough to be felt but not enough to be explained away, and panic began its quiet spread, not all at once but in ripples, a gasp here, a nervous laugh there, someone gripping an armrest too tightly, someone else already whispering a prayer learned in childhood, and then the oxygen masks dropped with a collective snap and hiss, yellow cups swinging down like sudden reminders of mortality, the cabin lights dimming as if the plane itself knew what was coming, and flight attendants moved quickly now, voices firm but eyes betraying fear as they instructed everyone to remain seated, to breathe, to stay calm. The calm was already slipping through the cracks, because people understood instinctively when normal ended and survival began, and through it all the girl in seat 14A remained still, the chaos washing around her without touching her, her eyes closed as if she were sleeping through turbulence, but she wasn't asleep, she was listening. To the pitch of the engines, to the timing of the alarms bleeding faintly through the cabin walls, to the subtle, uneven vibrations traveling up through the floor and into the soles of her shoes. Signals most people never learned to read, and memories stirred quietly, memories she had packed away long ago under layers of ordinary life. Memories of simulators and briefing rooms and nights where the margin between control and catastrophe was measured in seconds, and when the plane dipped again, harder this time, a collective cry rose from the cabin, fear no longer whispered but spoken aloud. And that was when she opened her eyes, slow and deliberate, as if waking from a long, disciplined rest, her gaze steady as it lifted to the aisle, to the overhead panels, to the nearest flight attendant struggling to keep her balance, and for the first time someone noticed her, not because she moved dramatically, but because there was an absence of panic in her expression that felt out of place, unsettling even, as though she were watching a familiar story unfold rather than living inside it, and she reached up, calmly removed her headphones, the soft click barely audible against the roar of fear, and in that small, almost insignificant gesture was the quiet beginning of a moment that would later be replayed in news reports and whispered retellings, the moment before the legend resurfaced, the moment when the girl unnoticed, became the one person who understood exactly what was happening, and exactly what needed to be done. She stood up slowly, not with the sudden panic, driven movements filling the cabin around her, but with a deliberate calm that seemed almost unreal against the chaos, her feet finding balance as the aircraft shuddered and dipped, and for a split-second time felt stretched, as if the plane itself paused to watch her rise, and that was when the nearest flight attendant noticed her, eyes widening in alarm as training kicked in and she rushed forward through the narrow aisle, one hand braced against a seatback, her voice sharp with urgency as she called out, "Ma'am, please sit down." Because in moments like these standing passengers meant danger, injury, loss of control, but the girl didn't flinch or raise her voice or argue. She simply turned her head slightly and spoke, and her Words didn't compete with the noise, they cut through it, calm, clear, fearless, carrying a confidence that didn't need volume to be heard. "I can help." And something about the way she said it made the flight attendant hesitate, not because protocol allowed it, but because instinct recognized it, the tone of someone who knew exactly where she stood and why, and as those words left her mouth, the cockpit seemed to feel it too, because inside, the alarms continued to wail, but the captain stopped speaking mid-sentence, his hand hovering above a switch, his co-pilot glancing at him in confusion as if both men had sensed, without understanding how, that something had shifted, and back in the cabin the girl moved forward with purpose, her hand steady despite the turbulence as she glanced at the exposed panels near the forward galley, at the emergency procedures placarded in plain sight, at the small details most passengers never read, her eyes tracking faster than fear could follow. And when she reached the cockpit door, the captain barely had time to protest before she was already speaking again, explaining in precise, clipped language what she was seeing, what she was feeling through the airframe, what the instruments were telling them even as they contradicted each other. And the men listened despite themselves. Because her voice carried the unmistakable weight of experience, not memorized instructions but lived reality, and as she stepped inside the cockpit, the alarms didn't stop, but they seemed less overwhelming, as if order had entered the room, and her hands moved with practiced confidence as she scanned the controls, fingers hovering, never rushing, recognizing layouts, redundancies, failures, and she reached for the emergency radio with the ease of someone who had done so 100 times before under far worse conditions, adjusting frequency, correcting drift, ignoring tremor that shook the fuselage as she spoke into the mic. "Mayday, this is civilian flight 217 requesting military assistance." Her voice steady and unmistakably authoritative, and then there was nothing but seconds, long, brutal seconds where the only sounds were static, alarms, and the collective breath of everyone listening, seconds where passengers clutched each other, where the flight attendant forgot to breathe, where the captain stared at the instruments as if daring them to make sense, and just as doubt began to creep in, just as the silence grew heavy enough to break hope, a voice cut through the static, crisp, controlled, unmistakably military. "This is Raptor 1, F-22 escort inbound." And the effect was immediate and electric, because even those who didn't understand the words felt the shift, felt the presence of something powerful and precise entering their story, and in the cockpit the captain's shoulders sagged with relief while the co-pilot let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the voice on the radio wasn't finished, and there was a pause, not of confusion, but of assessment, before the pilots asked, "Who's flying that plane?" A simple question that carried layers of meaning because they could hear it too, the way commands were being issued, the way the aircraft was being held together by skill rather than luck. And the girl didn't rush her answer or dramatize it. She simply leaned slightly closer to the mic, eyes flicking once more over the failing systems, the horizon indicator, the trembling altitude readout, and she answered softly, her voice almost gentle against the roar of the engines, as if she was speaking to old friends rather than elite fighter pilots screaming through the upper atmosphere toward her. And in that moment before she finished her sentence, the entire aircraft seemed suspended between past and present, between the life she lived now and the one she had left behind, between anonymity and recognition, between disaster and survival, and every person on board, though they didn't yet know it, was listening for the name that would change everything. "This is call sign Raven," she said, her voice low and even, not announcing herself so much as stating a fact. And the moment the words left her mouth, the radio went silent in a way that felt heavier than noise, the kind of silence that meant someone on the other end was recalculating everything they thought they knew. And inside the cockpit the alarms still screamed, but no one moved, as if the aircraft itself were waiting. And then disbelief bled through the speakers. A single voice at first, careful, almost reverent, "Raven," followed by another, sharper with recognition, "The Raven who flew Black Ops in the Pacific." And that was when the weight of history settled into the narrow cockpit, because that name wasn't in public records or documentaries. It belonged to action reports stamped classified, and to pilots who had watched impossible missions come back intact. And outside, high above the struggling civilian jet, the F-22 pilots adjusted formation instinctively, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect did, wings shifting to a tighter escort, positioning themselves like guardians rather than observers. And back inside the cockpit, the captain glanced at the girl, really looked at her for the first time, noticing the quiet authority in the way she held herself, the absence of hesitation in her eyes, and when she answered, "Yes, long time ago," there was no pride in it, no nostalgia, just a simple acknowledgement of a life lived and set aside. And then she was already moving again, listening as the Raptors began issuing instructions. Their voices crisp and precise, calling out altitude adjustments, trim corrections, thrust changes in rapid succession, and she followed them flawlessly, her hands moving in perfect coordination, adjusting controls with a sensitivity that bordered on instinct, compensating for lag and asymmetry before the instruments even fully reflected the changes, and gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, aircraft responded, the wild vibrations smoothing out, the nose stabilizing, the horizon line settling where it belonged, and a collective breath moved through the cabin as panic loosened its grip. Because people could feel it, feel the difference between falling and flying, and passengers who moments ago had been praying now stared forward in stunned silence, watching through parted cockpit curtains as the girl from seat 14A commanded the sky with quiet mastery, and as the jet steadied, the alarms began to fall silent one by one, replaced by the steady hum of engines under control, and in that fragile calm the F-22 pilot spoke again, their tone no longer questioning but collaborative, treating her as an equal, as someone whose judgment they trusted without reservation, and she responded in kind, concise, and precise, calling out confirmations, anticipating next steps, weaving civilian limitations with military precision, and in that shared airspace between past and present, between secrecy and survival, the legend of Raven wasn't reborn with fanfare or applause. It simply resumed its purpose, holding hundreds of lives aloft with steady hands while the world below remained unaware that history had briefly returned to the sky. The plane touched down safely, not with the violent jolt many had braced for, but with a controlled, almost gentle firmness as the wheels met the runway, rubber screaming briefly against asphalt, before the roar softened into a rolling thunder, and for half a heartbeat there was disbelief, a fragile pause where no one was certain it was truly over, and then the cabin erupted, applause crashing through the air in waves as if sound itself could release what fear had been holding captive, hands clapping wildly, some people laughing through sobs, others crying openly without shame, strangers clutching one another in relief, heads bowed, lips trembling with prayers of gratitude finally answered, and in the cockpit the captain closed his eyes for a moment longer than necessary, forehead resting against the yoke as the final reading stabilized, his hands shaking now that there was no longer a reason to be steady, while behind him the girl who had been a passenger only an hour ago loosened her grip on the controls and exhaled slowly, deeply, as if returning a borrowed breath to the world, and outside the aircraft, as emergency vehicles paced the runway and lights flashed in red and blue celebration, two F-22 jets swept past in a wide, graceful arc, engines humming with restrained power, flying low and slow in a deliberate salute that sent a ripple of awe through the windows, passengers pressing faces to glass, pointing, whispering, recording, unaware that they were witnessing something rare and unscripted, a gesture never meant for cameras, and as the aircraft came to a full stop and the engines wound down, the door finally opened and cool air rushed in, carrying with it the weight of what had almost been lost, and military officers boarded the plane with measured steps, uniforms crisp, expressions serious yet unmistakably relieved, scanning the cabin not with suspicion but recognition. And they didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, didn't even ask her name because they already knew, because stories like hers lived quietly in classified corridors and unspoken respect, and passengers fell silent as the officers approached seat 14A, now empty, the hoodie draped casually over the armrest like an afterthought, and the girl stood among them, suddenly just another traveler again, her presence unassuming, her gaze lowered as if she wished to disappear back into anonymity, and there was no ceremony, no announcement, no speech for the crowd that would later hunger for details, just a brief exchange of nods, a hand placed over a heart, a mutual understanding that some service did not require applause, and as she walked off the plane quietly, blending into the line of shaken but grateful passengers, one of the pilots from outside stepped forward, helmet tucked under his arm, eyes sharp yet softened with something like reverence, and he spoke not loudly but clearly enough for those nearest. "Here, welcome back, Raven." Words that carried years of memory, loss, and shared sky, and she paused only briefly, offering the smallest nod in return, not turning back, not lingering, and moments later she was gone, swallowed by the terminal, by ordinary life, by the anonymity she had chosen long ago, and when the last passenger disembarked and the cabin lights dimmed, seat 14A remained empty, just fabric and metal and silence, but everyone who had been on that flight would remember it forever, because legends don't always announce themselves with thunder or medals or history books. Sometimes they sit quietly with a hoodie pulled low, waiting for the moment the world needs them again. And when that moment comes, they rise, they do what must be done, and they disappear once more, leaving behind not their name, but their impact written invisibly across the lives they saved.